Oh, right. Some pretty amazing news today as it's been breaking and it's sort of been going over to the weekend. But the first major bank in Canada, of which we have five, has apologized for freezing people's bank accounts during the Emergencies Act, which was a response to the Freedom Convoy. This would be Scotiabank offering their sincere apologies for any hurt and inconvenience the situation may have caused to Benjamin Dichter, one of the organizers and spokespeople for the Freedom Convoy. Now, this is very, very important. You can split hairs on the apology and say, hey, legally, they're not actually saying what anything they did was wrong. They apologize for the hurt the situation may have caused, not their direct actions. Yes, 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 all of that is true. They're not fully... This is as close as you're going to come without forcing their hand legally. But this represents a lot of things. So that's one. The second big thing is, the next line is when they pretty much put it on the RCMP, they say, well, we acted as quickly as we could once the RCMP said we didn't have to anymore. Basically, once the Emergency Act ended, a lot of people had their bank accounts unfrozen. Now today, originally on Ben Dichter's Substack, Mark Petrone penned the first article on this whole situation. The National Telegraph, and me, I did a follow-up doing this. Now, since then, great news, Andy Lee, the journalist who had her bank accounts frozen for even just covering the convoy, the banks have now come out and said she can e-transfer again. So she still had restrictions. So Dichter, Chris Babber, Tamara, all the convoy organizers, sort of that, and Bridget and all that, all the people who are very public, they had their bank accounts frozen during the Emergencies Act. We don't care if your dying children need insulin and life-saving medication. Screw you. Then it was unfrozen after the Emergencies Act. And Scotiabank came in and said, hey, we unfroze as soon as the RCMP said we could. Now, this is interesting because the RCMP and the government said, no, we didn't direct anyone to freeze anyone's bank accounts. They bragged about it publicly, then they lied about it. Now, this isn't the first thing the government has lied about, but this is no. It is much more likely that the banks, not that the banks are the most trusting organizations, but it's much more likely the banks are telling the truth here, that it was the government who did this, rather than the government saying, oh, it was the banks that did it. Now, the banks might not be the most reputable people in the world, but they're not going to just freeze all the accounts of the government's enemies simultaneously, right? Unless there's sort of a government list and point them to it. Now, it is true. The banks should have pushed back more. The fact that they freeze people's bank accounts who had no criminal record and there was no court order telling them to do so severely hurt them. They lost, TD itself lost $8 billion in market share from the beginning of the Emergencies Act to the end of it. So this apology is very significant in a lot of ways. One, it shows that the banks and the institutions see the writing on the wall. And they have seen the justification for the invocation of the EA crumble. Lots of things. So as we know, the narrative was this is foreign funded and extremist. And this is one of the reasons you can invoke the Emergency Act is like if there's a foreign power about to seize control of blah, 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 blah. So that's why they tried to really push this foreign funded narrative. That was destroyed. The CBC had to retract that article. Again, they didn't base the Emergencies Act on any RCMP data or any police. They based it on CBC articles that ended up being retracted. So that was one thing. The other thing is, yes, foreign funding didn't happen. FinTrack, our financial monitor, said there was no terrorism, no money laundering. This is in a House Judiciary investigation under oath. He even got snarky and said the only mistake people made donating to Freedom Convoy is thinking they lived in a free country. So that's what the financial monitor is saying. The government's claiming terrorism and money laundering. The organization in charge of monitoring terrorism and money laundering said, no, that's not what happened. People just were under the mistaken impression that Canada was a free society. So that should show you where some disconnect is. Now, the reason the banks are going to apologize is, one, it was sent to Ben Dichter. And this is an important reason why Dichter left the red zone when they were arresting people willy-nilly like Tamara and Chris. Tamara and Chris cannot talk about any of this for years until all the legal stuff clears, and the government can, again, keep them buried in legal injunctions for years. And the banks don't have to worry about Tamara or Chris right now, because if they start talking about the banks publicly, well, then the government can just say breach of bail conditions and throw them in jail, and then it goes away, and they can't really do anything, and the story then becomes the government, not the banks. However, with Dichter, this is sort of coming down to the wire here of the Minerva injunction, which was put upon all of them by the courts. So the delay game the government and the institutions could play with Dichter was a timeline of months, not years. So they kind of had months to read the writing on the wall, see all the narratives crumble, and say, okay, we need to say something here. And the reason is not to protect them from legal liability or anything. I mean, you're not going to win a lawsuit against the major banks. I mean, you can. It's more of a sue to settle type thing. But I think the institutions, the banking institutions, make their money off people trusting them to hold their money. No sane person who has anti-government views, no matter how mild they are, if you had the opportunity to keep your money in a Swiss bank, American bank, and a bank in the Cayman Islands, would choose the Canadian banks over any of those. Now, if you're a hardcore liberal supporter, okay, like the money said that it was an occupation of Ottawa. You can do that thing. But if you're a reasonable person who disagrees with some liberal policies, you know your money is not safe in a Canadian bank. And losing billions of dollars on the bank run after the EA, Scotiabank has done the correct calculation and said, okay, soon Dichter's Minerva injunction ends, so we can start talking about Freedom Convoy stuff. He has hinted about starting or being involved in a new organization that will talk about these issues and keep them going, which will be, out of the country in Canada and not funded but through Canadian financial institutions, so they cannot shut the government. Canadian government won't be able to shut it down like it did the previous ones. And it is best to try and restore consumer confidence in them, to sort of bite the bullet and say, okay, yeah, it wasn't us, it was the government here, and start to backtrack as fast and as hard as they can. So they're really laying the groundwork for that, because let's say Dichter, Tamara, and all the Convoy people can get together a class action lawsuit for $250 million, 500, like half a billion dollars. Again, even if you lose that lawsuit flat out $500 million, the greater damage is in public perception. It's the fact that TD lost $8 billion during the Emergency Act because people took their money out of the banks because they didn't trust the banks. So more important than any money that Dichter and the Freedom Convoy organizers could ever sue for is consumer confidence in the banks. So that is, they've kind of realized, okay, we need high consumer confidence. We need Canadians to feel like if they put their money in Scotiabank, we're going to keep it in there. The banks are all simultaneously backtracking. You can tell that they might be even watching, they'll probably even watch this video. Andy Lee's bank account was unfrozen now, and if you are someone who has had your bank account frozen and it's still being messed with, I highly suggest you reach out to me. You can comment on the video below. You can message the National Telegraph on Twitter or Facebook or DM us. Find some way to get in contact with us, because we will cover it and follow up. If there's anyone in the country who still has their bank accounts frozen because you supported the convoy, we will draw attention to that, because now's the time to get it unfrozen, because the banks have realized there was no justification for what they did, and they stand to lose billions and billions of dollars if they keep going down that track. So this is all around very good news. Another narrative has crumbled surrounding the opposition to the Freedom Convoy, and the banking institutions have now given a moderate mea culpa on their actions. So expect a bit of a change in tune from the government on this. I wouldn't be surprised if Jean Charest and Patrick Brown sort of drop their occupation of Ottawa stuff and really try and go a bit quiet on this, because this is one of those. I mean, it's ironic, because this is the tactic the government's trying to take with Tamara and Chris is pile on charges, so they plead and apologize for something minor to then say, aha, look, they're guilty because they said sorry about this one thing. Now there's a sorry from the institutions on the other side. So the Freedom Convoy people have correctly played the waiting game, and now the first sorry has come from Scotiabank. So the first admission of guilt is not from the Freedom Convoy, it's the people who oppose the Freedom Convoy, and that is very big news.